Hello there, friends. Welcome back to Lore with Grandpa Ben. The Van der Linde gang wasn't always a desperate, haunted group. There was a time when they were a family, bound together by choice and shared ideals. They believed they were different from common criminals, that they had a code, a purpose, a higher calling. To understand how that family came to be and how it eventually fell apart, we need to go back to the beginning, to the men who built it from nothing. At the center was Dutch van der Linde, a man with a silver tongue and grand visions. He could quote philosophy and poetry, spoke of freedom and fighting tyranny, made people believe that their outlaw life had meaning. Born in 1855 to Dutch immigrants who'd come to America seeking opportunity, Dutch grew up in the Midwest during a tumultuous time. His parents struggled to make their way in this new land, facing the prejudices that many immigrants endured, working hard for little reward. Dutch's father died when the boy was young, though the exact circumstances have been obscured by time and Dutch's own retelling. Dutch always claimed his father was wronged by powerful men, exploited by wealthy business owners who cared nothing for the common person, that he died broken and penniless because the system was designed to crush people like him. Whether this was literal truth or a story that grew and evolved in Dutch's mind over the years, it planted something deep in his heart, a profound hatred of the established order, of the wealthy elite who seemed to prosper while ordinary people suffered, of a civilization built on the backs of the exploited. Left without a father and with a mother who likely struggled to provide for him, Dutch learned early that the world was not kind to those without power or wealth. But he was clever, charismatic even as a young man, with a natural gift for reading people and understanding what motivated them. He educated himself voraciously, reading whatever books he could get his hands on, teaching himself to think critically about the world around him. He discovered the philosophers and writers who spoke of freedom and resistance, of the rights of man and the corrupting influence of unchecked power. Evelyn Miller's writings about the nobility of nature and the corruption of civilization became his gospel, his guiding light. Miller wrote about how modern society was destroying the natural world and the natural man, how progress was really regression, how the push toward cities and industry was killing something essential in the human spirit. These ideas resonated deeply with Dutch, giving him a framework to understand his own anger and resentment. Dutch formed his own philosophy about how the world should be, a world where people lived free from the constraints of corrupt civilization, where a man's worth wasn't measured by his wealth or station, but by his character and his actions, where small communities of like-minded individuals could live according to their own codes rather than laws imposed by distant governments that didn't understand or care about them. It was a beautiful vision, romantic and idealistic. Though philosophy doesn't fill your belly or put a roof over your head, by his late teens and early 20s, Dutch had already begun living outside the law. The exact nature of his early crimes remains unclear, as outlaws rarely keep detailed records of their beginnings. And Dutch himself would tell different versions of his early exploits depending on his audience and his mood. But we can be fairly certain that by the mid-1870s, when Dutch was in his early 20s, he had made a name for himself as a clever and charismatic outlaw. Someone who could talk his way out of trouble as often as he shot his way out. Someone who seemed to have grander ambitions than the average criminal. Around 1876 or 77, accounts vary on the exact year, Dutch met the man who would become his partner, his brother, his conscience for the next 2 decades. Hosea Matthews was about 11 years older than Dutch, born around 1844, which meant he'd already lived through considerable hardship by the time their paths crossed. Hosea had been married once to a woman named Bessie, whom he clearly loved deeply. He'd tried living an honest life, working legitimate jobs, being a respectable citizen, but it hadn't taken. The marriage ended badly, leaving Hosea with a profound sense of loss that he'd carry for the rest of his life, though whether Bessie left him because of his occasional criminal activities or whether he turned to crime after she left was never entirely clear. By the time he met Dutch, Hosea was an accomplished con man and thief, someone who could read people with uncanny accuracy, who understood human nature in all its complexity and weakness. He was practical where Dutch was idealistic, patient where Dutch was impulsive, wise where Dutch was passionate. Hosea had learned through hard experience that survival often mattered more than principles, that sometimes the smart play was to walk away rather than stand and fight, that taking care of the people who depended on you was more important than making grand gestures. The story of how Dutch and Hosea met has taken on an almost mythical quality within the gang's history, told and retold around countless campfires. According to the most common version passed down among gang members, they encountered each other on the road somewhere in the Midwest, each planning to rob the other, each seeing the other as an easy mark. Dutch saw an older man traveling alone and thought him vulnerable. Hosea saw a young man full of swagger and thought him foolish. Both were wrong. When they both revealed their intentions, exactly when and how this happened varies with the telling. Instead of the violence that might have been expected, something else occurred. Based on what both men would later say, they recognized something in each other, some quality that suggested they were more alike than different. They started talking and kept talking, and somewhere in that conversation they realized they could be more effective working together than separately. Dutch had vision and passion, the ability to inspire people and make them believe in something larger than themselves. Hosea had the practical skills and experience to turn Dutch's grand ideas into workable plans. Dutch could see the big picture, could imagine audacious schemes that might actually work. Hosea could see the details, could identify the flaws and weaknesses that needed to be addressed. Dutch was the heart of the operation. Hosea was the head. Together they were formidable in ways that neither could have been alone. They formed a partnership right there on that road, and it would endure for more than 20 years, through good times and bad, through success and failure, through the building of a family, and ultimately through its destruction. In those early days there was a genuine friendship between them, a mutual respect and affection that went beyond mere partnership. They complemented each other perfectly, covering each other's weaknesses, amplifying each other's strengths. For several years in the mid to late 1870s, it was just the two of them, two outlaws making their way across the frontier. They pulled confident schemes and small robberies, staying ahead of the law, always moving, never staying in one place long enough to be caught. They learned the landscape of the American West, learned which towns had competent lawmen and which didn't, learned where to hide and how to disappear when necessary. They were successful, not in the sense of becoming wealthy, but in the sense of surviving and even prospering in a hard, unforgiving world. But both men understood that to pull off bigger jobs, to really make the kind of money that could set them up for life, they'd need more people. They'd need specialists, people with different skills, people they could trust with their lives. The question was how to find such people, and once found, how to bind them together into something cohesive and loyal. Dutch had a gift for this that would serve the gang well for many years. He had an almost supernatural ability to spot lost souls, people who'd been broken or abandoned or betrayed by the world, people who needed something to believe in, and he could give them that belief. He didn't just recruit criminals looking for their next score. He recruited people looking for family, for purpose, for meaning. He offered them a vision of a better way to live, a code of honor that elevated their crimes into something almost noble. In those early years, they picked up a few people whose names have been lost to history, people who rode with them for a while before dying or drifting away or being caught by the law. Building an outlaw gang isn't a straightforward process. People come and go, circumstances change, and not everyone is suited for that life in the long term. But through it all, Dutch and Hosea remained constant, the foundation upon which everything else was built. Then around 1877, everything changed. They found a boy who would alter the trajectory of the gang in ways neither of them could have predicted, a boy who would become the heart and soul of the Van der Linde gang for the next 2 decades. Arthur Morgan was born in 1863 in the northern United States, arriving in the world during the height of the Civil War, in a time when the nation was tearing itself apart. His mother Beatrice died when he was very young, so young that Arthur would have almost no memories of her, just a vague sense of loss in the stories others told him. The cause of her death was never clearly established. It could have been illness, complications from childbirth, or any of the 100 other things that claimed women's lives on the frontier in those days. His father, Lyle Morgan, was a petty criminal, an outlaw, though from what Arthur would later recall, not a particularly successful one. Lyle was the kind of man who seemed to make all the wrong choices, who couldn't hold on to money when he had it, who drank too much and loved too little. He was cruel in the casual, thoughtless way that some men are, not going out of his way to hurt his son, but certainly not going out of his way to care for him either. Arthur grew up knowing his father more as a source of disappointment and occasional violence than as any kind of positive influence. In 1874, when Arthur was just 11 years old, his father was finally arrested for larceny, caught stealing, as he'd been caught before and would likely have been caught again if given the chance. But this time there was no escaping consequences. Lyle Morgan was tried, convicted, and sentenced to hang, and Arthur, that 11-year-old boy, witnessed his father's execution. Imagine what that does to a child, standing in a crowd, watching his father climb the gallows steps, watching the noose placed around his neck, watching the trap door open and his father drop. It's the kind of memory that burns itself into your mind, that you carry with you forever whether you want to or not. Arthur would later say that watching his father hang taught him something about the cost of the outlaw life, about what happened when the law finally caught up with you. But it didn't teach him to avoid that life, because how could it? He was 11 years old with no other family, no other options, no other path visible to him. For the next 3 years, Arthur survived on the streets. The details of these years are fragmentary, lost to time and to Arthur's own reluctance to talk about them later in life. But we can imagine what it must have been like for a child alone in the rough frontier towns of the 1870s. He would have stolen food to eat, found shelter wherever he could, learned to fight because he had to, learned to be suspicious of everyone because trust could get you killed. He became, in his own later description, a wild delinquent, angry at the world that had taken everything from him, frightened in ways he'd never admit, growing hard and mean as a defense mechanism because softness was a luxury he couldn't afford. He got into fights, stole whatever he needed, and gradually transformed from a frightened orphan into something more dangerous, more feral. It's likely he'd have ended up dead or in prison before reaching adulthood if his path hadn't crossed with Dutch and Hosea's. In 1877, when Arthur was 14 years old, he encountered Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews. The exact circumstances of their meeting have never been definitively established. Perhaps Arthur tried to pick their pockets, perhaps they found him begging or fighting in some frontier town, perhaps he tried to steal from their camp and got caught. However it happened, instead of running him off with a beating or worse, they saw something in him. What exactly did they see? Based on how they spoke of him later, we can infer they recognized his intelligence. Even after years on the streets, Arthur was clearly smart, observant, capable of learning. Perhaps they saw his anger and recognized it as something that could be channeled and directed. Perhaps they saw his desperation and recognized someone who would be fiercely loyal to anyone who showed him genuine kindness. Or perhaps they simply saw a child who needed help and decided to help him. Dutch and Hosea didn't just recruit Arthur Morgan. They adopted him, took him in as their son in every way that mattered, except legal paperwork. And Arthur, who'd had nothing and no one for 3 years, who'd been alone and afraid even when he pretended otherwise, found himself suddenly part of something. He had 2 fathers now, 2 men who seemed to genuinely care about him, who invested time and effort into raising him properly. Dutch taught Arthur the intellectual side of things. He taught him to read and write properly. Arthur had likely learned the basics before his father died, but Dutch refined and expanded that education. More importantly, Dutch taught Arthur to think about the world, to question authority and established wisdom, to see beneath the surface of things. He taught Arthur his philosophy about freedom and resistance to tyranny, about living free from the constraints of corrupt civilization. And Arthur, still young and impressionable, absorbed these lessons completely, making Dutch's worldview his own. Dutch also taught Arthur the practical skills of the outlaw life. He taught him to shoot, and Arthur proved to have a natural aptitude for it, steady hands and sharp eyes making him deadly with a gun, even as a teenager. He taught him to ride, to really ride, not just sitting on a horse, but becoming one with the animal, reading its moods, understanding how to get the best from it. He taught him to fight with his fists, to be able to handle himself in close quarters when guns weren't an option. But perhaps most importantly, Dutch taught Arthur about loyalty. He drilled into the boy that the gang, their little family, was everything, that loyalty to the gang superseded all other considerations, that you never abandoned or betrayed the people who'd taken you in and given you a home. For Arthur, this message resonated deeply. Dutch had saved him, had given him everything when he had nothing. How could Arthur ever repay that debt? Only through absolute, unwavering loyalty. Hosea took charge of Arthur's education in different ways. Where Dutch was passionate and philosophical, Hosea was practical and patient. He taught Arthur how to track, how to read signs in the wilderness that others would miss: bent grass, disturbed earth, broken branches that told a story if you knew how to read them. He taught him to hunt, to understand animal behavior, to know where game would be at different times of day and different times of year. He taught him to survive in the wilderness with minimal supplies, to find water and shelter, to live off the land when necessary. Hosea also taught Arthur something more subtle and perhaps more valuable: judgment. Hosea would talk through situations with Arthur, asking him what he thought should be done, exploring the consequences of different choices, helping him understand that every action had ramifications that rippled outward in ways you couldn't always predict. He taught Arthur to think before acting, to plan for contingencies, to always have an escape route in mind before committing to a course of action. And Hosea, perhaps more than Dutch, taught Arthur that sometimes the smart play was to walk away. Not every insult required a violent response. Not every opportunity was worth the risk. Sometimes surviving to fight another day was more important than proving a point or defending your pride. This wisdom would serve Arthur well over the years, even if he didn't always follow it. Between these two fathers, Arthur grew from a frightened orphan into a capable young man. He became Dutch's right hand, the person Dutch turned to when something needed doing. The gang wasn't just Arthur's family, it was the only family he'd ever known. Through the late 1870s and into the 80s, the gang grew. They picked up Bill Williamson, a dishonorably discharged soldier desperate for approval; Javier Escuella, a Mexican revolutionary who'd fled his homeland after a failed rebellion; Uncle, an older man who claimed past glory but mostly complained about his lumbago; Susan Grimshaw, who'd been Dutch's lover years before but stayed to organize the camp. Charles Smith joined too, half black, half Native American, caught between worlds his whole life. He brought skills most others lacked, tracking and hunting learned from his mother's people. Charles was perhaps the most genuinely honorable person in the gang. Lenny Summers joined as a teenager after killing a man who'd helped murder his father. Smart and idealistic, he believed completely in Dutch's vision. Sean McGuire came from Ireland, full of energy and bravado. And there were women: Mary Beth Gaskill, Karen Jones, Tilly Jackson, full members who went on jobs and ran cons alongside the men. The 1880s were golden years for the Van der Linde gang. They pulled successful jobs, made good money, stayed ahead of the law. Dutch gave speeches around campfires about freedom and fighting civilization's encroachment. People believed him, or wanted to, because the alternative was admitting they were just thieves and killers. During these years, Arthur fell in love with a woman named Eliza. She became pregnant, and they had a son named Isaac. But Arthur couldn't leave the gang, couldn't give up the outlaw life. He visited when he could, gave them money, but was never really there. Then both Eliza and Isaac were killed during a robbery at their home, murdered for $10, while Arthur was off with the gang. Their deaths hardened Arthur, deepened his loyalty to the only family he had left. In 1885, a 12-year-old boy named John Marston was caught stealing by homesteaders in Illinois who planned to hang him. Dutch intervened, saved the boy's life, and took him into the gang. John's early life had been harsh. Born in 1873, his mother died giving birth to him. His father, a Scottish immigrant, was blinded in a bar fight and died when John was 8. The boy spent years in an orphanage before running away, committing his first murder at age 11. For Arthur, now in his early 20s, John's arrival created unexpected tension. After years as Dutch's only protege, Arthur suddenly had to share that attention. Arthur was assigned to help raise John, and the kid was difficult, reckless where Arthur was careful, impulsive where Arthur was measured, but slowly a bond formed between them. They became brothers in a complicated way, competing for Dutch's approval, but covering for each other in dangerous situations. As the gang prospered through the 1890s, the world changed around them. Territories became states with organized law enforcement. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency could pursue criminals across state lines. The Van der Linde gang was becoming too well known, too notorious. In 1894, Abigail Roberts joined the gang. She fell in love with John, and in 1895 gave birth to a son named Jack. John, immature and unable to face responsibility, denied the boy was his. Around 1896, John actually left the gang for about a year, abandoning Abigail and Jack. This created a rift, especially with Arthur. When John returned around 1897, Dutch welcomed him back with open arms, but Arthur saw John's abandonment as a fundamental betrayal of the loyalty the gang represented. By 1899, cracks were showing. Hosea worried they were running out of time. Dutch insisted on one more big score, a ferry in Blackwater carrying $150,000. With that money, they could finally disappear to somewhere safe, maybe even Tahiti, that tropical paradise Dutch sometimes mentioned. Hosea had doubts. The job felt too risky, too public, but Dutch was determined. They brought in new guns, including Micah Bell, a killer with a mean streak that made Arthur's skin crawl. As they prepared for Blackwater in May of 1899, none of them knew they were riding toward the end of everything. Part 2, the Blackwater Massacre. Dutch had spent months planning the Blackwater ferry robbery. The ferry would carry $150,000, enough to set them up for life. Arthur Morgan and Hosea Matthews weren't there. They'd been sent on a separate lead. Their absence would prove critical. The initial robbery seemed to go well. The gang members on the ferry, Dutch, Micah Bell, John Marston, Javier Esquella, Davy and Mac Callender, Sean McGuire, and based on accounts, Jenny Kirk, accessed the money fairly easily. Then everything went wrong. The Pinkertons and local law showed up in force far sooner than expected. Dutch would later suggest they'd known the gang was coming, though how remains uncertain. The ferry robbery turned into a massacre, a chaotic shootout in the middle of a populated modern town. In the chaos, something terrible happened. Dutch shot and killed a young woman named Heidi McCourt, an innocent civilian who happened to be on the ferry. According to John Marston, Micah had encouraged Dutch to do it. For a man who claimed they only hurt those who deserved it, this was a stark betrayal of his own principles. The shooting spread through Blackwater streets, citizens caught in crossfire. Multiple deaths, lawmen, Pinkertons, gang members, civilians. The gang suffered devastating losses. Davy Callender took a fatal gut wound. Mac Callender got separated. was later captured and killed by Agent Milton of the Pinkertons. Jenny Kirk was shot and killed. Sean McGuire was knocked unconscious and captured by bounty hunters. John Marston was badly wounded. The gang fled in complete disarray, forced to abandon Mac and Sean. They lost the money, or most of it. Dutch claimed to have stashed some in Blackwater, but in the chaos that seemed meaningless, the Van der Linde gang, which had survived over 2 decades through careful planning, had just committed the most catastrophic failure in their history. The law came after them with unprecedented force. Blackwater and the surrounding region went on lockdown. The gang couldn't go back to old camps, couldn't head south where law was concentrated, couldn't stay still. Dutch made a desperate decision. They'd head north into the grisly mountains of Amberino. They rode north through worsening weather. Davy was dying slowly, John delirious with infection. A late spring blizzard hit, reducing visibility to nothing. The cold was brutal, deadly. Arthur spotted an abandoned mining town called Coulter, rough buildings that at least provided shelter from the storm. Davy Callender died that first night in Coulter. They buried him in frozen ground. Mac was missing, likely dead. Jenny was dead. Sean captured. The gang had been devastated. Dutch gave speeches about surviving together, about this being just a setback. Some believed him because the alternative was too frightening. Others stared into fires, wondering if they'd made a terrible mistake. Arthur and Hosea kept their doubts quiet, but couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had broken in Blackwater, something that couldn't be fixed. Micah Bell had survived, and instead of blaming Dutch for the disaster, he praised him, told Dutch he'd done what needed to be done, that killing that woman didn't matter. And Dutch, shaken and defensive, listened to Micah in a way that deeply worried Arthur. Part 3, Coulter and the Descent from the Mountains. It was Arthur who spotted the abandoned mining town through the swirling snow, a collection of rough buildings that represented their only hope for survival. Coulter had been built years earlier during a mining boom that had gone bust, leaving behind structures that were barely more than shells, but which at least offered 4 walls and a roof against the brutal elements. The gang moved into these buildings with desperate relief, getting out of the wind and snow that had been threatening to kill them all. The first order of business was getting fires started. They scavenged wood from abandoned furniture and structural beams, piling it into fireplaces and stoves, coaxing flames to life with numb fingers. As warmth slowly returned to the buildings, people began to assess the damage the flight from Blackwater and the journey through the mountains had inflicted. John Marston was in the worst condition of those who'd survived the initial flight. He'd been wounded during the Blackwater Massacre, though the exact nature and extent of his injuries from the robbery itself remained unclear in all the chaos. But what had really torn him up happened during the gang's flight into the mountains. John had been sent ahead to scout, and somehow during that scouting mission, he'd been attacked by wolves. Mountain wolves are dangerous predators at the best of times, and a man alone on foot or on a horse that gets spooked is vulnerable in ways that are terrifying to contemplate. The wolves had gotten to John, had torn at him with teeth and claws, and the damage they'd inflicted was severe. His face bore the worst of it. Deep gouges and tears that would leave permanent scars, marks he'd carry for the rest of his life, as a reminder of how close he'd come to dying in those frozen mountains. Beyond the physical damage, John was fighting infection and hypothermia, drifting in and out of consciousness, burning with fever one moment and shaking with chills the next. Abigail stayed by his side constantly, doing everything she could to keep him alive, wiping his face with cold cloths when the fever raged, piling blankets on him when the chills took over, forcing water and what little food they had between his lips when he was conscious enough to swallow. Arthur found himself checking on John regularly, despite their complicated relationship and despite all the other demands on his time. There was something about seeing John like this, vulnerable, possibly dying, with Abigail desperate beside him and young Jack asking when his father would wake up, that cut through Arthur's resentment and reminded him that John was family, that you didn't abandon family, no matter what had passed between you. Davy Callender, who'd taken that gut wound during the Blackwater Massacre, was beyond saving. Everyone knew it, including Davy himself. Gut wounds like that were essentially death sentences in an era before modern medicine. The best you could hope for was that the end would come quickly rather than being drawn out over days of agony. Davy hung on for several hours after they reached Coulter, tended by his brother Mac's absence weighing heavy in the room. He died that first night, surrounded by people who'd been his family for years, and they buried him the next morning in ground so frozen they had to use pickaxes to break through the surface. The burial was brief out of necessity. Standing in the wind and cold for extended periods wasn't safe, but Dutch said words over the grave about loyalty and sacrifice, about how Davy had been a good man and a true friend, about how they'd remember him. The words felt hollow to Arthur, listening to Dutch eulogize a man who died because Dutch's plan had gone catastrophically wrong, but he kept his thoughts to himself. This wasn't the time or place for that conversation. Beyond John and the grave that now held Davy, the gang had to deal with numerous other injuries and ailments. Several people had frostbite on their fingers, toes, or faces from the exposure during the flight. Susan Grimshaw organized the women to tend to these injuries, doing what they could with limited supplies and no proper medicine. Charles had wounded his hand during some part of the chaos, though he tried to hide it and keep working. Others had cuts, bruises, sprains, the accumulated damage of a desperate flight through brutal terrain, and everyone was hungry. They'd fled Blackwater with whatever supplies they'd been able to grab in the chaos, which wasn't much. What food they had wouldn't last more than a couple of days if they were lucky. In these frozen mountains, hunting would be difficult but not impossible. There were deer and elk that survived the winter at these elevations, and where there were prey animals, there were predators, which meant meat if you were skilled and lucky enough to bring them down. Arthur volunteered for the hunting parties, taking Charles despite his injured hand because Charles's tracking skills were invaluable. They ventured out into the snow following tracks, looking for any game they could find. It was slow, cold work requiring patience and skill, but eventually they managed to bring down deer, providing meat that would keep the gang fed for at least a little while longer. During these hunting expeditions, Arthur and Charles had time to talk, to process what had happened in Blackwater and what it might mean for the gang's future. Charles, who'd only been with the gang for a few years and hadn't developed the deep emotional attachment that some of the longtime members had, could see things more clearly than Arthur could at this point. "That job shouldn't have happened," Charles said quietly as they tracked a deer through the snow. "Too risky, too public. Hosea was right to oppose it." Arthur wanted to defend Dutch, wanted to explain that things had just gone wrong in ways nobody could have predicted, but the words died in his throat because Charles was right, and Arthur knew it. The job had been too risky, and now people were dead because of it. While some members of the gang hunted and others tended to the injured and kept fires burning, Dutch, Arthur, and Micah ventured further from Coulter to scout the surrounding area and look for supplies they desperately needed. It was during these scouting missions that they discovered they weren't alone in these mountains. The O'Driscoll gang had a camp not too far from Coulter. The O'Driscolls were rivals of the Van der Linde gang, and the enmity between them ran deep and personal, rooted in history that went back years. The feud between Dutch Van der Linde and Colm O'Driscoll had murky origins that different people told different ways. What seems most likely, based on various accounts, is that Dutch and Colm had been partners once, probably back in the early days when Dutch was first building his gang. They'd worked together for a period, pulling jobs, splitting the proceeds, but something had gone wrong between them, perhaps a disagreement about methods, perhaps money, perhaps just two strong-willed men who couldn't continue sharing leadership. The partnership ended badly, and what followed was a cycle of escalating violence and revenge that had claimed lives on both sides. At some point, Dutch had killed Calm's brother. The circumstances of that killing were disputed. Dutch claimed it was self-defense or that the man had deserved it, while Calm claimed it was murder. In retaliation, Calm had killed a woman named Annabelle, who Dutch had loved deeply. Annabelle's death had devastated Dutch in ways that still showed years later when her name came up. She'd been important to him, perhaps the great love of his life, and Calm had taken her away as payment for his brother's death. This killing had transformed the rivalry from a professional competition between outlaw gangs into something deeply personal, a blood feud that would only end when one or both of the gang leaders were dead. So when Dutch, Arthur, and Micah encountered O'Driscolls in the mountains, there was no possibility of peaceful coexistence or mutual avoidance. They were enemies, and enemies in this context meant people who would try to kill each other on sight. The Van der Linde gang needed the supplies the O'Driscolls had, needed them desperately enough to take them by force. The fight was brief but vicious, the kind of close-quarters combat where there's no room for mercy or hesitation. The Van der Lindes killed the O'Driscolls they found and took everything useful from their camp: food, ammunition, warm clothes, medicine, if there was any. It was ugly, brutal work, but survival often is. During these expeditions, they captured an O'Driscoll alive, a young man who they brought back to Coulter for interrogation. Dutch and Arthur questioned him, trying to learn what Colum's gang was doing in the area, how many of them there were, whether they posed a serious threat. The O'Driscoll, frightened and facing people who just killed his friends, talked freely enough. He told them about an O'Driscoll plan to rob a train belonging to Leviticus Cornwall, a wealthy industrialist and oil magnate. He gave them details about the plan, the timing, the route. This information represented an opportunity. The gang desperately needed money and supplies, and stealing this job from the O'Driscolls would serve the dual purpose of getting them what they needed while also hurting their enemies. Dutch made the decision quickly. They'd rob Cornwall's train themselves, using the O'Driscolls' own plan against them. But before they could focus fully on planning that robbery, there was another urgent matter to attend to. John Marston had gone missing during the chaos after Blackwater, and while some had assumed he was dead, Abigail refused to believe it. She begged Arthur to look for John, to at least try to find him and bring him back if he was still alive. Arthur agreed, taking Javier Esquia with him, and the two men ventured back out into the snow to search. They followed what trails they could find, asked the captured O'Driscoll if he'd seen anyone, searched the areas where John might have been during the flight from Blackwater. Eventually they found him, barely alive, hypothermic and torn up by wolves, lying in the snow where he'd collapsed. Seeing John like that, vulnerable, possibly dying, having clearly suffered terribly, affected Arthur in ways he didn't entirely understand. All the resentment he felt toward John, all the frustration with his irresponsibility and his abandonment of Abigail and Jack, it didn't disappear. But it was joined by something else: pity, concern, and perhaps a recognition that John was still young, still had time to change and grow if he survived this. They got John back to Coulter, where Abigail broke down in relief at seeing him alive. Over the following days, as John slowly began to recover, fighting through the fever and the pain, a subtle shift occurred in Arthur's attitude toward him. John had come close to dying alone in the snow, had experienced something that changed him in ways that would only become apparent later. And Arthur, watching John's slow recovery, found his anger softening into something more complicated. On another scouting mission, the gang made a discovery that would add a new member to their family in the most unexpected way. They came across a homestead, a small cabin and barn, the kind of place where a family might try to make a life in these harsh mountains. But something was clearly wrong. The place had been ransacked, there were signs of violence, and in the snow outside the cabin lay a dead man, approaching cautiously with weapons ready. They found that the O'Driscolls had been here. The man lying dead in the snow was Jake Adler, killed by the O'Driscolls for reasons that probably didn't matter much to them. Maybe he'd tried to fight back, maybe they'd killed him for fun, maybe they just wanted what little he had. His body had been left where it fell, beginning to be covered by fresh snow. Inside the cabin, the place had been thoroughly ransacked. Furniture was overturned, possessions scattered, anything of value taken. It looked like the O'Driscolls had spent time here, had made themselves comfortable in someone else's home while doing terrible things, and in the cellar, hiding in the darkness, terrified into near catatonia, they found Jake Adler's widow. Sadie Adler had been in that cellar for days, maybe longer, hiding from the O'Driscolls who might come back, not knowing if they'd left for good or if they were just away temporarily. She'd been without food or water, frozen with terror, traumatized by what had been done to her and what she'd witnessed done to her husband. When the Van der Linde gang members found her and called down into the cellar, Sadie was initially too frightened to respond, thinking they might be more O'Driscolls come back to finish what they'd started. It took gentle coaxing to get Sadie to emerge from the cellar, to convince her that these were different people, that they weren't going to hurt her. When she finally came out, the gang members could see the toll the last several days had taken on her. She was filthy, exhausted, barely able to stand, her eyes hollow with trauma and grief. She'd lost her husband, lost her home, lost everything in the span of what was probably a few terrifying hours when the O'Driscolls had arrived. They brought Sadie back to Coulter, wrapping her in blankets, putting her on a horse with someone to steady her, since she was too weak to ride alone. Back at camp, Susan Grimshaw and the other women took charge of her care, giving her water and food, letting her warm up by the fire, giving her space to process what had happened, while also making sure she didn't hurt herself or freeze to death in her traumatized state. For the first days after her rescue, Sadie barely spoke. She'd sit by the fire, wrapped in blankets, staring at nothing, clearly replaying events in her mind that nobody else could see. When she did speak, it was usually just single words or short phrases. Yes, no, thank you, the minimum necessary for basic communication. The vibrant woman she'd been before the O'Driscolls came to her home was buried under layers of trauma that might never fully heal. But even in those early days, careful observers like Arthur could see something else beneath the trauma: rage. It was banked for now, hidden under the shock and grief, but it was there, burning quietly, waiting. Sadie Adler had been broken by what happened to her, but she wouldn't stay broken. Eventually, that rage would find an outlet, and when it did, she'd transform into something the O'Driscolls would learn to fear. With John slowly recovering, with Sadie being cared for by the women, with some food secured through hunting, the gang turned its attention to the train robbery. They needed this job to succeed. They needed the money and supplies it would bring. More than that, they needed to prove to themselves that they could still pull off a job successfully, that the Blackwater disaster hadn't broken them as a criminal organization. The train robbery was planned carefully, using the information they'd gotten from the captured O'Driscoll. They'd stop the train in a remote area where the law would be slow to respond, take what they needed quickly, and be gone before anyone could organize pursuit. Arthur led the operation, taking Lenny, Javier, Charles, and a few others. The robbery went well, not perfectly. There were complications and difficulties, as there always were, but well enough. They stopped the train, intimidated the guards and passengers into compliance, took supplies and money, and got away clean. More importantly, they'd proven they could still function as a gang, could still pull off jobs despite the devastating losses at Blackwater. But the robbery had consequences beyond the immediate gains. Leviticus Cornwall was not a man to cross lightly. He was one of the wealthiest, most powerful industrialists in the country, with connections to politicians, lawmen, and the Pinkertons. He would not take this robbery lying down. He would use all his considerable resources to hunt down the people who dared to steal from him. The gang had traded their immediate survival for a dangerous new enemy, though they wouldn't fully understand the cost of this trade for some time. As the weather began to clear and temperatures started to rise with spring's advance into the high mountains, the gang prepared to leave Coulter. John was recovering slowly, but was well enough to travel if they were careful. Sadie, while still traumatized and withdrawn, had agreed to come with them. She had nowhere else to go, no home to return to, no family left alive. The gang was all she had, even though she barely knew these people. Charles Smith, whose tracking and wilderness skills had proven invaluable during their time in Coulter, volunteered to scout ahead and find a suitable location for their next camp. They needed somewhere safer than these frozen mountains, somewhere warmer, somewhere they could recover properly from the Blackwater disaster and figure out their next moves. Charles rode out, and after several days returned with news of a location in the heartlands of New Hanover near a town called Valentine. The gang packed up what little they had. They'd arrived in Coulter with almost nothing and weren't leaving with much more, and prepared for the descent from the mountains. They held a brief service at Davy Callender's grave, Dutch saying a few more words about loyalty and sacrifice, about how they'd never forget their fallen brother. Then they mounted their horses and began the journey down from the Grizzlies, leaving behind the frozen hell that had been their refuge and their prison for these terrible weeks. As they rode down from the mountains, heading toward the green valleys of the heartlands, visible in the distance, Arthur looked back one last time at those forbidding peaks. They'd survived Coulter when survival had seemed impossible. They'd buried their dead, tended their wounded, fought off enemies, and pulled off a successful robbery. They'd taken in Sadie Adler and saved John Marston's life. They'd proven they could still function as a gang despite the devastating losses at Blackwater. But Arthur couldn't shake a feeling that had been growing in him since that terrible day on the ferry. Something had broken in Blackwater, something fundamental, and their time in Coulter hadn't fixed it. Dutch was different, more erratic, more willing to listen to Micah's poisonous suggestions than to Hosea's wisdom. The gang felt more fragmented, more uncertain about their future. The law knew who they were now and would be hunting them with unprecedented intensity. And the money they'd lost in Blackwater, that $150,000 that was supposed to solve all their problems, was gone, leaving them with nothing to show for all the death and disaster. As they descended into the heartlands, Arthur tried to push these dark thoughts aside and focus on practical matters. They had a new camp to set up, jobs to plan, wounds to continue healing. They'd survived the worst that fate could throw at them, or so it seemed at the time. Surely things would get better from here. Surely the worst was behind them, but Arthur was wrong about that. The worst wasn't behind them. The worst was still ahead, waiting for them in the valleys below, in the schemes Dutch would concoct, and the enemies they'd make, and the betrayals that would eventually tear their family apart. Coulter had been a trial, a test of their resilience and their will to survive. They'd passed that test, but harder tests were coming. Tests that some of them would fail. Tests that would ultimately destroy everything they'd built over more than 2 decades together. For now, though, they rode down from the mountains into the green valleys of spring, carrying their hopes and fears, their wounded and their dead's memories, their loyalty and their growing doubts. The Van der Linde gang had survived Blackwater and Coulter, but the question that would haunt them in the months to come was simple and terrible. For what purpose had they survived? What future awaited them in a world that no longer wanted them to exist? And how many more of them would have to die before Dutch would finally admit that his dreams of paradise and freedom were nothing but beautiful lies that had led them all to ruin? Part 4, Valentine and a Deadly Cough. The heartlands of New Hanover were a revelation after the frozen hell of the Grizzlies. Green grass stretched across rolling hills, wildflowers bloomed in the warming spring air, and the temperature was comfortable enough that people could work outside without fear of freezing to death. The change in environment lifted everyone's spirits noticeably. It felt like maybe they could breathe again, like maybe the worst was truly behind them. The gang set up camp at a location called Horseshoe Overlook, a sheltered area on a bluff overlooking the Dakota River near its confluence with other waterways. The location was nearly perfect for their needs. It had good visibility of the surrounding terrain so they could spot anyone approaching, fresh water from the river below, plenty of game in the area for hunting, and tree cover that would hide their camp from casual observation. Most importantly, it was remote enough that the law wouldn't stumble across them accidentally, but close enough to civilization that they could scout for opportunities and acquire supplies. Valentine was the nearest town, located just a few miles to the northwest. It was a rough cattle herding settlement, the kind of place where ranchers brought their livestock for sale and slaughter, where cowboys and ranch hands came to blow off steam, where the businesses catered to men who worked hard, drank hard, and didn't ask too many questions about each other's pasts. For a gang of outlaws trying to lie low and rebuild after a devastating disaster, Valentine was nearly ideal. Dutch sent people into town in small groups to scout, to get a feel for the place, to listen to conversations and watch the flow of money. The goal was to understand Valentine, who had power, who had money, where opportunities might lie, and most importantly, what the law enforcement situation was like. Arthur spent considerable time in Valentine during those first weeks at Horseshoe Overlook, becoming a semi-regular presence in the saloon, on the streets, and around the businesses. Valentine's sheriff was a man trying his best to maintain order in a place that didn't particularly value order. He wasn't corrupt, from what Arthur could tell, but he was also pragmatic enough to know that he couldn't crack down on every minor vice and infraction without making enemies of the people who essentially ran the town. Gambling, prostitution, public drunkenness, and occasional brawls were tolerated as long as they didn't get too far out of hand. This created an environment where the Van der Linde gang could operate with relative freedom as long as they were smart and didn't push things too far. Arthur met many people during his time in Valentine. He encountered ranchers struggling to make their operations profitable in an era of increasing corporate consolidation. He met cowboys who worked hard for little pay and found their main pleasure in drinking and gambling. He saw businessmen trying to navigate the transition from frontier settlement to something approaching civilization. And he met people on the margins, folks who'd fallen on hard times, who were struggling with debt or illness or bad luck. It was in Valentine, outside the train station, that Arthur encountered a man who would change the course of his life in ways he couldn't possibly have understood at the time. Thomas Downs was a thin, sickly-looking man with a persistent cough that racked his frame and sometimes doubled him over. Despite his obvious ill health and his own obvious poverty, Downs was soliciting donations for the poor, standing in the street with a donation box, trying to convince passers-by to contribute money to help those even worse off than himself. Arthur barely noticed Downs during that first encounter, just another person in a busy town, just background noise in the constant flow of humanity. He might have spoken briefly to Downs or just walked past him. The exact details don't matter, because Arthur didn't see any significance in the encounter, just a sick man trying to help people sicker than himself, the kind of well-meaning but ultimately futile effort that Arthur had seen countless times before. But Thomas Downs would become significant later, in a way that Arthur couldn't have predicted. Several weeks after that first unremarkable encounter, Leopold Strauss, the gang's moneylender who loaned funds to desperate people at extortionate interest rates, sent Arthur to collect a debt from Downs. This was exactly the kind of work Arthur hated but did anyway, because it was part of providing for the gang, part of keeping the family fed and safe. Arthur rode out to the Downs homestead, a small, struggling ranch where Thomas lived with his wife Edith and their son Archie. It was clear from the moment Arthur arrived that these people had nothing, that they were barely surviving, that whatever money Thomas had borrowed from Strauss had probably gone toward basic necessities or medical care for his worsening condition. But Strauss wanted his money, and Arthur's job was to collect it. What followed was ugly in the way that this kind of work was always ugly. Arthur intimidated Thomas Downs, physically threatened him, made it clear that refusal to pay wasn't an option, even though it was obvious the man had nothing to give. Edith Downs begged Arthur to leave them alone, explained that her husband was sick, that they had no money, that taking what little they had would leave them destitute. But Arthur had heard similar pleas countless times before, had learned to tune them out and focus on getting what he'd been sent to collect. Thomas Downs, desperate and terrified, somehow scraped together the money Strauss demanded, probably taking it from money they needed for food or medicine. And during this confrontation, with Arthur looming over him and his family pleading in the background, Thomas Downs coughed violently, and blood sprayed from his mouth, spattering across Arthur's face and clothes. Arthur reacted with disgust and annoyance, wiping the blood off his face with the back of his hand, cursing the sick man for getting his disease-ridden fluids on him. He took the money, left the Downs family to their despair, and rode back to camp thinking nothing more about it than annoyance at having to do this particular kind of degrading work and disgust at having been coughed on by a sick man. What Arthur didn't know, couldn't have known in that moment, was that Thomas Downs had tuberculosis, consumption, as many people called it in that era. And when Downs coughed blood on Arthur, he passed that disease to him. The bacteria entered Arthur's system through the mucous membranes of his mouth, nose, or eyes, or through tiny cuts in his skin, and began to multiply and spread. Arthur Morgan had just been infected with the disease that would kill him, and he didn't even know it. The symptoms wouldn't appear for weeks or months, giving the disease time to establish itself in his lungs before he'd have any idea something was seriously wrong. Beyond this fateful encounter with Thomas Downs, Arthur's time in Valentine was filled with the kind of work the gang specialized in. They pulled jobs around the town and the surrounding area, robbing homesteads, holding up stagecoaches, rustling cattle from ranches and reselling them in other areas. They were careful to avoid attracting too much attention, trying not to make enemies unnecessarily, taking from people who could afford the loss or who'd made their money through questionable means themselves. The gang members were settling into life at Horseshoe Overlook, developing routines and patterns. Pearson the cook would ride into Valentine to buy supplies when they had money. Uncle would sit around camp playing his banjo and complaining about his lumbago, while generally avoiding any real work. The women, Susan, Mary Beth, Tilly, Karen, and the slowly recovering Sadie, maintained the camp, did laundry in the river, cooked meals, and occasionally joined the men on jobs that required a woman's presence or a woman's touch. John Marston was recovering from his wounds, though the scars on his face would be permanent reminders of how close he'd come to dying. The experience had changed something in John, though it would take time for this change to fully manifest. He was more subdued than he'd been before, less cocky, more aware of his own mortality, but he still struggled with being a father to Jack, still kept Abigail at arm's length emotionally, still hadn't fully accepted his responsibilities. Arthur found himself spending time with Jack, the boy who was now 5 years old and curious about everything. Arthur would teach Jack to read using whatever books were available at camp, would tell him stories, would answer his endless questions about animals and places and how things worked. It was strange for Arthur playing the father figure to a boy who wasn't his son, especially when the boy's actual father was right there in camp but couldn't seem to connect with his own child. But Arthur felt responsible for Jack in ways that went beyond duty, perhaps because his own son Isaac had been killed at a young age, perhaps because Jack represented innocence in a world that seemed determined to destroy innocence wherever it found it. During this period at Horseshoe Overlook, Micah Bell's influence with Dutch continued to grow in ways that troubled many gang members. Micah had an uncanny ability to tell Dutch exactly what he wanted to hear, to validate Dutch's worst impulses, to encourage his most reckless ideas. Where Hosea would urge caution and careful planning, Micah would urge boldness and risk-taking. Where Hosea would question whether a job was worth the danger, Micah would insist that Dutch was smart enough to make anything work. Arthur watched this dynamic with increasing concern. He'd seen how Micah had encouraged Dutch to kill Heidi McCourt during the Blackwater Massacre. He'd watched Micah ingratiate himself with Dutch while showing contempt for almost everyone else in the gang. He'd observed how Micah would take credit for others' work while deflecting blame for his own failures. Everything about Micah set Arthur's teeth on edge, and he wasn't alone in this reaction. Most of the gang couldn't stand Micah, found him cruel and untrustworthy in ways that went beyond the normal criminality they all shared. But Dutch defended Micah, insisted he was loyal, claimed that people just didn't understand him or appreciate his strengths. And as the weeks passed, Dutch spent more and more time with Micah, listened more attentively to Micah's suggestions, seemed to value Micah's opinion above those of people who'd been with him for decades. Hosea watched this development with visible concern, but seemed unsure how to address it without creating a conflict that might split the gang. The gang pulled off a bank robbery in Valentine, a job that should have been relatively straightforward but became more violent than planned. They went in hard, established control through intimidation, and got the money from the vault. But on the way out, they encountered resistance from local lawmen who'd responded faster than expected. A shootout erupted on Valentine streets, with gang members and lawmen exchanging fire, citizens running for cover, chaos spreading through the town. They managed to fight their way out and escape, but they'd left bodies behind, lawmen who'd been killed in the gunfight. This was always something the gang tried to avoid when possible. Dead citizens could sometimes be explained or rationalized, but dead lawmen brought focused attention from other law enforcement agencies, particularly the Pinkertons. Each dead lawman meant more people looking for you, more resources devoted to catching you, more danger with each passing day. Dutch, riding high on the adrenaline and success of getting away with the money, dismissed these concerns. They'd shown Valentine and the law what the Van der Linde gang was capable of, he said. They'd proven they couldn't be kept down, couldn't be intimidated, were still dangerous and effective. But to Arthur and Hosea and some of the others, the Valentine bank robbery felt like another example of Dutch's increasing recklessness, his prioritization of dramatic gestures over smart, careful operations that had kept them alive for decades. During this time at Horseshoe Overlook, the gang learned that Sean McGuire, the young Irish hothead who'd been captured during the Blackwater Massacre, was being transported by bounty hunters, and there might be an opportunity to rescue him. Dutch immediately seized on this idea, seeing it as a chance to show that the gang looked after its own, that they didn't abandon family even when it was risky to rescue them. Arthur, Javier Escuella, Charles Smith, and the mysterious Josiah Trelawney tracked down the bounty hunters who had Sean. It was a tense operation requiring careful planning and precise timing. The bounty hunters were professionals, alert for exactly this kind of rescue attempt. But the gang managed to ambush them, killed or scattered the bounty hunters, and freed Sean without losing anyone in the process. Sean's return to camp was a moment of genuine joy in what had been a grim few months. He was as energetic and talkative as ever, full of stories about his captivity and escape, making jokes and lifting spirits with his sheer enthusiasm for being alive and free. For a moment it felt like maybe things were turning around, like maybe they'd weathered the worst of the storm and could start rebuilding properly. But Valentine was getting hot. The bank robbery had attracted attention, the law was more alert, and people in town were starting to notice the gang's presence, even though they'd tried to be discreet. Dutch, always planning ahead, had already been scouting other locations, looking for their next camp. He'd found something promising in Lemoyne, the Old South, near a town called Rhodes. It was swampy and humid, very different from the heartlands, but it had advantages. The law presence was light because local people didn't much like or trust government authority. And there were opportunities there, Dutch said, involving two wealthy families who hated each other and who might be manipulated into providing the gang with money and advantages. Before they moved, Arthur had an unexpected visitor. A letter arrived for him, delivered through the gang's mail system that used various aliases and post office boxes to maintain some operational security. The letter was from Mary Linton, a woman from Arthur's past, asking for his help with a family matter. Mary had been the love of Arthur's life once, back when they were both young and the world seemed full of possibilities. They'd been engaged, had planned to marry, had imagined a future together, but Mary's father had objected strenuously to her marrying an outlaw, had done everything in his power to break them apart. Eventually, Mary had given in to her father's pressure, had broken off the engagement, had married another man named Barry Linton and tried to build a respectable, legitimate life. Now, years later, Mary's marriage was over. Barry had died or they'd divorced. Arthur was never entirely clear on the details, and she needed help. Her family was in trouble. Her brother was involved with dangerous people, and she had nowhere else to turn. So she'd reached out to Arthur, the man she'd loved and left, asking for help, while being careful not to promise anything about rekindling their relationship. Arthur went to meet Mary, despite knowing it would be painful, despite understanding that helping her wouldn't change the fact that she'd chosen a different life, that they could never have the future they'd once dreamed about. He helped her deal with her family's problems, spent time with her, and felt all the old feelings resurface. The love, yes, but also the resentment at being abandoned, the anger at her father's interference, the sadness at what might have been. When the situation was resolved and Mary prepared to leave again, Arthur tried to convince her to stay, or at least to consider being part of his life again. But Mary couldn't do it. She cared for Arthur, perhaps even still loved him, but she couldn't live the outlaw life. She wanted stability, respectability, safety, all things Arthur couldn't provide as long as he rode with the Van der Linde gang. So she left, and Arthur was forced once again to confront the cost of his choices, to understand that his loyalty to the gang and to Dutch meant giving up any chance at a normal life, at love, at family. This encounter with Mary left Arthur in a melancholy mood as the gang prepared to move to Lemoyne. He'd spent his entire adult life with the gang, had sacrificed everything for Dutch's vision of freedom and resistance to corrupt civilization. And what did he have to show for it? He was approaching 40 years old with no family of his own, no home, no legitimate accomplishments. He'd lost his son Isaac and Isaac's mother Eliza years ago. He'd lost Mary to the demands of the outlaw life. He had the gang, certainly, but was the gang enough? Was Dutch's philosophy of freedom and living outside civilization's constraints worth all the things Arthur had given up? These were dangerous questions, the kind that could undermine everything Arthur had built his life around. So he pushed them away, buried them under the immediate demands of preparing for the move to Lemoyne, of planning jobs, of taking care of the practical matters that kept the gang functioning. There would be time for existential reflection later, or so he told himself. For now, there was work to do. As spring turned toward summer in 1899, the Van der Linde gang packed up Horseshoe Overlook and prepared to move south to Lemoyne. Dutch promised this new location would be better, that the opportunities there were too good to pass up, that this move would be the start of their real recovery from the Blackwater disaster. Hosea had his doubts, but kept them mostly to himself. Partly because he was tired. The coughing that had started in Coulter was getting worse, not better. And partly because he'd learned that opposing Dutch too directly often backfired. And so they rode south, toward the swamps and humidity of Lemoyne, toward the scheming and violence that awaited them there, toward Sean McGuire's death and the kidnapping of Jack Marston and all the disasters that would follow. Arthur rode with them, his face bearing Thomas Downes's blood spatter that had long since been washed away, but had left behind something far more permanent and deadly. Tuberculous bacteria multiplying in his lungs, beginning the slow process that would eventually kill him, though he had no idea yet that he was dying, had no reason to think that a routine debt collection would prove to be the beginning of his end. Part 5, Roads, Blood, and Betrayal. Lemoyne was the Old South, a land still carrying Civil War scars. The gang set up at Clemens Point, a peninsula jutting into a lake, beautiful but oppressive. Rhodes was the nearest town, sleepy and fading, held together by stubborn pride. The region was dominated by two families, the Greys and Braithwaites, who'd been feuding for generations. The exact cause was buried in the past, but the hatred was real. Dutch saw opportunity in this feud. He'd done this before, playing both sides, taking from both, while they focused on each other. It was a classic Dutch plan, clever and ambitious. The gang started working for both families, careful not to let either know they were also helping the other. They stole horses for one, destroyed crops for the other. For a while it seemed to work. Money came in, the families seemed happy, and Dutch was convinced he could string this along indefinitely. Then they pulled a job in Rhodes, stealing gold from a church. Simple, until they rode into an ambush. The Greys had set them up, knew they were coming, had prepared a trap. Gunfire erupted from both sides of the street. Sean Maguire, the young Irishman who'd survived Blackwater and captivity, who'd just been rescued, took a bullet to the head. He died instantly, falling from his horse, his constant chatter silenced forever. The gang barely escaped, had to leave Sean's body behind. Sean's death hit hard. He'd been young and full of life. His death was senseless, the result of Dutch's scheme going wrong. People started questioning whether playing the families against each other was wise. Dutch insisted they could make it work, that Sean's death would be meaningless if they didn't see the plan through. Hosea argued for cutting losses and leaving, but Dutch wouldn't hear it. The Braithwaites, sensing weakness, made their move. They invited Dutch to their mansion, ostensibly for business. While Dutch, Arthur, and John were there, the family struck at what mattered most. They kidnapped Jack Marston, Abigail, and John's young son, took him right out of camp. When they returned and found Jack missing, Abigail's grief and rage were terrible. The gang mobilized immediately, but had no idea where Jack had been taken. They knew the Braithwaites had done it, but when they confronted matriarch Catherine Braithwaite, she mocked them, revealed she'd known their game all along. She'd taken Jack to punish their arrogance. What happened next showed how far Dutch had fallen. He led the entire gang to Braithwaite Manor, and they burned it to the ground. They shot anyone who resisted, chased the family from their ancestral home, set fire to the building. Catherine Braithwaite died in the assault. Dutch personally ensured her death, showing no mercy. This wasn't about Jack anymore. It was about Dutch's wounded ego, about someone outsmarting him. But Jack wasn't there. Catherine revealed in her final moments she'd sold the boy to Angelo Bronte, a crime lord in Saint Denis. They'd destroyed an entire family and were no closer to finding Jack. Arthur, watching this, felt something cold settle in his chest. They'd just committed a massacre over wounded pride. This wasn't what they were supposed to be. But Dutch didn't seem to feel any remorse, didn't recognize he'd violated everything he claimed to believe in. They had to find Jack. The boy was somewhere in Saint Denis, held by a crime lord they knew nothing about, in a city they'd never operated in before. Part 6, Saint Denis and the Breaking Point. Saint Denis was a real city. Tall buildings, electric lights, trolley cars, thousands of people. It was modern in a way that made the frontier seem truly dead. Angelo Bronte lived in a mansion there, controlling much of the criminal underworld while maintaining respectability. He was connected to politicians, police chiefs, businessmen, exactly the kind of enemy the gang was ill-equipped to handle. Dutch, Arthur, and John went to Bronte's mansion trying diplomacy. Bronte received them with false courtesy, enjoying having Dutch at his mercy. He toyed with them, made them wait, made it clear he could have them killed whenever he wanted. Eventually, after making them perform tasks for him, Bronte returned Jack unharmed. The boy had been treated well, even given nice clothes. Bronte had never intended to hurt Jack. He'd been sending a message, demonstrating his power. The encounter was humiliating. Dutch had been made to look weak, made to dance to another man's tune. It stung his pride terribly. He talked about Bronte in ways suggesting revenge was coming. The gang moved camp to Shady Bell, an abandoned plantation mansion in the swamps. It was rotting and oppressive, surrounded by alligators. The camp felt like a tomb. Hosea's health continued declining. The old man was coughing blood now, clearly dying. Dutch should have focused on getting Hosea care. But instead, he obsessed over Bronte and schemes to make money. Dutch announced a new plan. Bronte had mentioned a trolley station in Saint Denis holding significant cash. More importantly, it would be stealing from Bronte's city. Hosea argued it was too risky, too public, but Dutch was determined. The trolley station job went wrong immediately. Guards were more numerous than expected, the layout wrong, and the law responded impossibly fast. They got some money, but the cost was terrible. The job turned into a shootout in the middle of the city. Then Dutch announced they were robbing a bank. Right there in the chaos, they'd hit Saint Denis Bank. It was insane, desperate, but Dutch insisted this was their opportunity. Hosea, despite everything, agreed to participate, perhaps hoping to keep people alive with his presence. The bank job was a nightmare. They went in hard, but the law was already converging. Alerted by the trolley station violence, they were trapped, surrounded. Then Agent Milton and dozens of Pinkertons showed up. Milton called for surrender, said it was over. Dutch tried to negotiate using hostages. Milton wasn't interested. What happened next happened fast. Hosea, trying to defuse the situation, stepped forward to talk to Milton. Milton shot Hosea Matthews in the chest. The old man, Dutch's partner for nearly 30 years, died on that bank floor, murdered while trying to prevent bloodshed. Before anyone could process Hosea's death, Lenny Summers was shot and killed by Pinkertons. 2 deaths in seconds. 2 people who'd been family, gone in the chaos of a job that should never have happened. The survivors fought desperately. John Marston was shot and captured. Arthur, Dutch, Micah, Bill, and Javier fought through the bank, out onto the streets, through alleys and rooftops, killing lawmen and Pinkertons, leaving a trail of bodies across Saint Denis. They made it to the docks and fought their way onto a departing ship. With nowhere else to go, they hid aboard, not knowing the destination. The ship left Saint Denis with the gang hidden below, having lost Hosea, Lenny, and John in one catastrophic day. As the ship sailed into darkness, Arthur sat trying to process what had happened. Hosea was dead. Hosea, who'd been a father to him as much as Dutch, who'd taught him patience and wisdom, who'd been the voice of reason for decades. Lenny, that smart kid with his whole life ahead, was dead. John was captured and would probably hang. Dutch, rather than showing grief or regret, seemed energized. He talked about how they'd shown the Pinkertons what they were capable of, how they'd fought their way out against impossible odds. He seemed almost proud of the body count, the chaos, the destruction. Micah supported Dutch completely, praised his leadership, said the job had been glorious despite the losses. Arthur wanted to throw Micah overboard, but Micah was just a symptom. The disease was Dutch's pride, his refusal to admit mistakes, his willingness to sacrifice anyone for his own ego. The ship sailed for days, eventually wrecking on an island called Guarma in the Caribbean. The gang found themselves in a foreign land, caught in a revolution, with no clear way home. They'd escaped the Pinkertons, but landed in a different nightmare. Part 7, Paradise Lost. Guarma was beautiful and terrible. The island was controlled by dictator Alberto Fusar, who ran sugar plantations with enslaved labor. A revolution was brewing, led by Hercule Fontaine and his desperate rebels. The gang washed up barely alive. They were injured, exhausted, lost in a foreign land with no money, supplies, or plan. They quickly ran afoul of Fusar's soldiers and found themselves on the run in unfamiliar jungle. They encountered Fontaine and his rebels. When Dutch met Fontaine, something sparked. Recognition of kindred spirits. Fontaine spoke eloquently about freedom, liberating his people from a brutal dictator, building a better world. Dutch was drawn to this vision like a moth to flame, but Arthur could see that Dutch wasn't helping out of genuine belief. He was using the revolution for his own purposes, seeing it as a way to gain resources and find escape from the island. Dutch talked about freedom and resistance, but he'd sacrifice Fontaine's people as readily as his own. The gang participated in increasingly violent operations. They attacked plantations, assaulted military positions, destroyed supply lines. The violence in Guarma was different. No pretense of robbery or code. This was war, and people died in numbers that shocked even hardened outlaws. Arthur watched Dutch in his element, leading men in battle, giving speeches about fighting tyranny. But Arthur could see Dutch didn't actually care about these people or whether their revolution succeeded. Dutch just wanted off the island. Micah reveled in the violence. Guarma gave him license to kill without restraint. He shot prisoners, encouraged atrocities, acted like the brutal killer he'd always been. Dutch let him, seemed to approve. They helped Fontaine attack Fusar's fortress, a massive assault costing many revolutionary lives. They killed Fusar and accomplished the revolution's goal. Their reward was minimal. Fontaine arranged a ship back to America. Then they were done. The revolution they'd helped win would continue without them. The people they'd killed would remain dead. Dutch had used an entire revolutionary movement as a tool for personal escape. The journey back gave Arthur time to think. He was sick, had been for a while, coughing more, feeling weak. He attributed it to stress and violence, but something was wrong. More than physical sickness, Arthur was spiritually sick. Everything since Blackwater felt like a nightmare. The gang he'd known and loved was gone. In its place was something twisted and dark, led by a man who looked like Dutch but acted like a stranger. Hosea's death, Lenny's death, John's capture, the massacre in Saint Denis, the brutality in Guarma, it all weighed on Arthur's soul. When they reached American shores, it was clear time had passed, several weeks or months. Summer had turned to early fall. They didn't know what had happened while they were gone, if the others had survived, if John had been hanged. They made their way back to Lemoyne carefully. When they found the remnants of the gang, it was bittersweet. They'd survived, somehow, and moved to a new camp in the swamps at Lac. But everything had changed. The people left were haunted, traumatized, barely holding together. Sadie Adler had stepped up, helping hold things together. She'd completed her transformation, now fully a gunfighter, as capable as any man. John Marston had escaped prison before he could be hanged. Though the experience had changed him profoundly, the reunion should have been happy, but the mood was grim. Too many were dead or gone. They were wanted everywhere with bounties so high that every bounty hunter in America was looking. They had almost no money, no prospects, no realistic hope. Dutch immediately started planning the next job, as if nothing had changed. He talked about getting money to leave the country, to disappear where Pinkertons couldn't follow. Some still believed him, others just nodded because they had nowhere else to go. Arthur looked at Dutch's face and saw a stranger. The man he'd loved like a father was gone, replaced by someone hollow, revolutionary rhetoric hiding narcissism and desperation. The worst part was Dutch didn't seem to realize it. Part 8, the slow death. Arthur's illness had been progressing for months, though he'd been attributing the symptoms to stress, exhaustion, and the harsh conditions they'd been living under. The coughing had started subtly, just occasional clearing of the throat, a tickle that wouldn't go away, nothing that seemed significant. But over the weeks and months, it had gotten worse. The coughing became more frequent, more violent, leaving him breathless and shaken. Sometimes there was blood in what he coughed up, though he tried to hide this from others, didn't want them worrying about him when there were so many other concerns demanding attention. He felt exhausted all the time, bone-deep tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. He'd wake up after a full night's rest feeling like he hadn't slept at all. Simple physical tasks that had never been challenging before left him winded and weak. He was losing weight, his clothes hanging looser on his frame, his face becoming more gaunt and drawn. People noticed, made comments about him looking tired or thin, asked if he was feeling all right. Arthur always brushed these concerns aside, insisted he was fine. blamed the stress of recent months and the hard living conditions. But finally, after collapsing during a job, just losing his strength and falling to the ground, unable to get up for several frightening minutes, Arthur admitted to himself that something was seriously wrong. Whatever this was, it wasn't going away on its own, wasn't something he could power through with willpower and determination. He needed to see a doctor, needed to understand what was happening to him. So Arthur rode to Saint Denis, that modern city where doctors practiced real medicine with scientific knowledge rather than folk remedies and guesswork. He found a doctor's office and went inside, explained his symptoms, the coughing, the exhaustion, the weight loss, the blood. The doctor examined him thoroughly, listened to his chest with a stethoscope, asked detailed questions about when the symptoms had started and how they'd progressed. Then the doctor delivered his diagnosis with the kind of clinical detachment that medical professionals develop as a defense mechanism against constantly delivering terrible news. Arthur had tuberculosis, and it was advanced. The disease had been working its way through Arthur's lungs for months, destroying tissue, creating cavities, spreading through his system. There was no cure, no treatment that would save him. With rest, good nutrition, fresh air, and avoiding stress, Arthur might have a few months, perhaps as long as a year, if he was lucky. But without those things, and given Arthur's lifestyle, those things were impossible. He probably had even less time. Arthur left the doctor's office in a daze, walking the streets of Saint Denis without really seeing them, trying to process what he'd just been told. He was dying, not in the abstract way that everyone is technically dying from the moment they're born, but actually actively dying, with a timeline measured in months. All the violence he'd survived, all the gunfights where bullets had whistled past his head, all the close calls and narrow escapes that had punctuated his life, none of it mattered. What would kill him was a disease passed by a sick man's cough during a routine debt collection. There was a bitter irony to it that wasn't lost on Arthur. He'd beaten Thomas Downs, had intimidated and threatened a dying man to collect money for Leopold Strauss's money-lending operation. It had been ugly, degrading work, exactly the kind of thing Hosea had always questioned, the kind of job that made it hard to maintain the fiction that they were somehow noble outlaws fighting corrupt civilization. And that ugly, degrading work had killed him as surely as if Thomas Downs had shot him in the chest. Arthur thought about his life as he walked through Saint Denis, really thought about it in ways he'd been avoiding for years. He'd spent his entire adult life as an outlaw, had followed Dutch van der Linde without question from the age of 14. He'd robbed and killed, had done terrible things in service of Dutch's vision of freedom and resistance to civilization. And what did he have to show for it? No family. Isaac and Eliza were long dead. Mary had chosen a different life. No home, no legitimate accomplishments, no legacy beyond the trail of victims he'd left behind. He'd been loyal to Dutch and the gang for more than 20 years, had sacrificed everything for that loyalty, and now he was dying with nothing to show for it except regrets. But even knowing he was dying, even understanding that his time was limited, Arthur didn't tell anyone in the gang about his diagnosis, not immediately. What would be the point? They had enough problems without adding his impending death to their list of concerns. He'd keep working, keep doing jobs, keep providing for the gang as long as his failing body would allow him to do so. And maybe, with the time he had left, he could do something meaningful, something that would matter, something that would balance the scales just a little bit before he faced whatever judgment awaited him. This decision to keep his diagnosis secret meant Arthur carried his knowledge alone, a heavy burden that colored everything he did and saw. He watched Jack playing in camp and thought about how the boy would grow up after Arthur was gone. He looked at Dutch giving his speeches and saw the delusions more clearly now, saw how empty the words were, how little they'd ever meant. He observed Micah whispering in Dutch's ear and felt rage at this poison that was destroying the gang, even as disease was destroying Arthur's body. Everything seemed sharper, more immediate, more important now that Arthur knew his time was limited. The gang moved again, leaving the swamps of Lake for a camp in the mountains near Annesburg in a place called Beaver Hollow. It was a cave system that provided shelter but felt oppressive, tomb-like, appropriate for a gang that was slowly dying, even if most of its members didn't realize it yet. The people gathered at Beaver Hollow were scared, desperate, turning on each other, the bonds that had held them together for years finally fraying to the breaking point. Dutch's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic in ways that couldn't be ignored anymore. Some said he'd hit his head during the trolley station robbery in Saint Denis, that he hadn't been right since taking that blow to the skull. Others thought the accumulated stress and failures had simply broken something in his mind, revealed flaws that had always been there but had been hidden or compensated for by Hosea's influence. Whatever the cause, Dutch was clearly unwell, making decisions that didn't make sense, flying into rages over minor provocations, listening to Micah's worst suggestions while ignoring the counsel of people who'd been loyal to him for decades. Micah Bell had become Dutch's primary confidant, his constant companion, the person whose opinion Dutch valued above all others. Micah preached survival of the fittest, said they should abandon weak members of the gang, argued that loyalty was for fools, and that in the end every man had to look out for himself. And Dutch, who'd always claimed that loyalty was everything, that the gang was a family that looked after its own, was listening to Micah, was adopting these poisonous ideas, was becoming someone unrecognizable from the man who'd taken in an orphaned 14-year-old boy and given him a family. A woman named Molly O'Shea returned to camp during this period, drunk and desperate and barely coherent. Molly had been Dutch's lover, had been devoted to him, but Dutch had neglected her terribly in recent months, had become involved with a Native American woman, had treated Molly as if she didn't exist. In her pain and rage and desire to hurt Dutch the way he'd hurt her, Molly claimed she'd betrayed the gang to the Pinkertons, that she'd told Agent Milton everything, that she was responsible for all the disasters that had befallen them. Susan Grimshaw, that tough woman who'd kept the gang's camps running for years, who'd maintained discipline and order even as everything fell apart, shot Molly dead before anyone could stop her or question whether Molly's confession was even true. Susan had no patience for traitors, no mercy for anyone who'd betray the family, so she killed Molly there in camp, and they buried her without ceremony, without really investigating whether her drunken confession had been truth or lies. As it would turn out later, Molly's confession was false. She'd been lying, trying to hurt Dutch by claiming she'd destroyed the thing he valued most, the gang itself. But in her drunken state, Molly had signed her own death warrant, and Susan had executed that warrant without hesitation. It was another death, another piece of the gang torn away, another reminder that they were consuming themselves from within. Agent Milton and the Pinkertons finally found the gang at Lake, attacking in force with dozens of agents armed with modern weapons and determined to end the Van der Linde gang once and for all. The gang fought back desperately, holding off the assault long enough for people to escape, killing agents and watching their own people fall, barely surviving what should have been the final confrontation. During this chaotic battle, Arthur found himself face to face with Agent Milton himself. The Pinkerton offered Arthur a way out that seemed almost too good to be true. Give up Dutch Van der Linde, testify against him, and Arthur could go free. The Pinkertons didn't even particularly care about Arthur or most of the gang members. They wanted Dutch, wanted to make an example of him, wanted to prove that no outlaw could stay ahead of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency forever. Arthur's response to this offer was immediate and unequivocal. He told Milton to go to hell. Despite everything, despite his growing doubts about Dutch, despite his recognition that Dutch was leading them to destruction, despite knowing he was dying and had nothing to gain by staying loyal, Arthur couldn't bring himself to betray Dutch. Loyalty was too deeply ingrained, too fundamental to who Arthur was. Dutch had saved him, had raised him, had been a father to him for more than 20 years. Even if Dutch didn't deserve that loyalty anymore, even if Dutch had betrayed everything he claimed to believe in, Arthur couldn't be the one to give him up to the law. Arthur was seeing clearly now, with the clarity that comes from knowing you're dying. Dutch was leading them to destruction. Micah was poison, encouraging Dutch's worst instincts. The gang needed to split up, run in different directions, give up on Dutch's dreams, and just survive individually. But Dutch's pride demanded they stay together, die together if necessary. The local Wapiti tribe was being forced off their land by the army and oil companies. Their young leader, Eagle Flies, wanted to fight back and saw the Vanderlindes as potential allies. Eagle Flies' father, Chief Rains Fall, was peaceful, wanted his people to survive, had seen too many die in pointless fights against superior forces. Dutch saw opportunity in the Wapiti's struggle. He talked about helping them, fighting oppression, being brothers in arms. But Arthur could see Dutch didn't genuinely care about these people. He saw them as tools, would sacrifice them like he'd sacrificed Fontaine's rebels. Arthur found himself drawn to Rains Fall's peaceful wisdom, helping the chief save his people through negotiation. But Eagle Flies listened to Dutch, believing they could win through force. Dutch encouraged Eagle Flies to attack a military installation. The attack was a disaster. Wapiti warriors and gang members fought bravely, but faced soldiers with modern weapons. Eagle Flies was mortally wounded, dying in his father's arms. Rains Fall looked at Dutch with hatred and sorrow, seeing clearly that Dutch had used his son, led him to death for selfish purposes. Arthur watched another young man destroyed by believing Dutch Vanderlinde's lies. How many had to die before Dutch would admit his plans didn't work? Back at Beaver Hollow, tensions exploded. Micah openly called Arthur a traitor, said he'd been working against Dutch. Arthur, no longer caring about consequences, confronted Micah, called him a rat, said he'd been feeding information to Pinkertons. The gang split. Arthur and John on one side, Micah and supporters on the other, Dutch in the middle, unable or unwilling to see truth. Susan Grimshaw sided with Arthur, knowing he was right. Micah simply shot Susan dead without warning. He killed her and Dutch did nothing, said nothing, stood there while a woman loyal to him for decades bled out. That moment broke any remaining faith. John and Arthur finally accepted Dutch was beyond saving. The man they'd known was completely gone. The Pinkertons attacked Beaver Hollow in force. The remaining gang fought back, but it was hopeless, outnumbered and surrounded. Arthur knew this was the end, knew he'd never leave these mountains alive, but John could escape. John and his family could survive if Arthur gave them time. Arthur told John to run, take Abigail and Jack, and get far away. John didn't want to leave Arthur, knew what it meant, but Arthur insisted, promised he'd be right behind, a lie they both knew but John had to accept. John, Abigail, and Jack fled through the mountains. Arthur turned to face the Pinkertons, to buy them time. He fought with everything left despite his failing body, despite blood in his lungs, despite knowing he'd never see sunrise again. He fought because that's what Arthur Morgan did. He protected his family. In the chaos, Arthur had one final confrontation with Dutch and Micah. He called out Dutch one last time, tried to make him see what he'd become. For a moment, Dutch seemed uncertain, seemed to see through the fog consuming his mind. But Micah was there, whispering, calling Arthur a traitor, and Dutch couldn't break free. Arthur turned his back on them, focused on one thing, getting far enough that John and his family could escape. He climbed the mountain using his last strength, Micah pursuing. Dutch followed, torn between the two men who'd been his sons, unable to choose. At the mountain's peak as dawn broke, Arthur Morgan faced his end. He'd gotten John away, given him time and money to escape. That was all that mattered now, to a dying man who'd wasted most of his life but tried to do good at the end. There are different ways Arthur's story could end, depending on the choices he'd made, the honor he'd accumulated, but certain truths remained constant. Arthur died on that mountain at 36 years old. His tuberculosis, or Micah's violence, ended his life as the sun rose over the dying west. In one version, Arthur faced Micah in a brutal fight. Weakened by disease, Arthur couldn't win. As he lay dying, looking at the sunrise, his last words gasping with ruined lungs, "I gave you all I had. I did." Then he died, as peacefully as any outlaw could hope, watching the sun rise on a world he'd never see again. In another version, Dutch finally saw Micah for what he was, the rat who'd betrayed them all. Dutch walked away, left Micah alone with Arthur's body, unable to admit he'd been wrong, but at least not endorsing what Micah had become. Arthur Morgan died having lived more than many who lived twice as long. He'd been an outlaw, a killer, a thief, but in his final months facing death, he'd been something more, a protector, a helper, a man trying to do good with time left. He'd saved people, given them chances at better lives, died ensuring John Marston and his family could escape. His death marked the true end of the Van der Linde gang. What remained would be just shadows and echoes. Dutch descended from that mountain forever changed, having lost everyone who truly cared about him. He'd disappear into legend, becoming a ghost story, but the man who'd been Dutch van der Linde died on that mountain with Arthur. The sun rose over that mountain in fall of 1899, illuminating a world that had no room for outlaws anymore. The Van der Linde gang had been the last of their kind, and now they were gone, scattered or dead, remembered only by those they'd hurt and those they'd saved. Arthur's last thoughts, as vision dimmed and pain faded, were of hope. Not for himself, that was gone, but hope for John, Abigail, Jack. Hope they'd escape, build something real, that Jack would grow up in a world where his father's past didn't define him. It was the best gift Arthur could give, the final act of a man trying to do right at the end of a wrong life. As Arthur Morgan died watching the sun rise on a new century that would have no place for people like him, he found something that had eluded him most of his life: peace. He'd been loyal, not blindly anymore, but to the right people. He'd been honorable, finally, in the only way that mattered, and he'd sacrificed everything to give others the life he'd never have. That was Arthur Morgan's redemption, and it was enough. Part 9, Epilogue, What Comes After. John Marston escaped with Abigail and Jack, using money Arthur had given them. For weeks they moved constantly, staying ahead of Pinkertons, never stopping long enough to be found. Fear was constant. One mistake could mean capture or death. Time passed. Weeks became months, became years. By 1907, 8 years after Arthur's death, John had found a way to live honestly. He'd worked as a ranch hand at Pronghorn Ranch, saved money, proven he could live without crime. He found land for sale in West Elizabeth, in an area called Beecher's Hope. With money earned through honest labor, he bought it. It felt like victory, owning land, building a home, giving Jack the life John never had. Building the house was hard work. John wasn't much of a carpenter, but he learned. Abigail and Jack helped. Uncle showed up offering more advice than labor, but making himself useful. Then old friends appeared. Charles Smith returned from Canada, drawn by news of John's survival, wanting to help the man Arthur had died to save. The two men worked side by side, sometimes talking about Arthur, the gang, those final terrible days. Sadie Adler appeared too, older and harder. She'd become a bounty hunter, one of the best, known for ruthlessness and skill. She came to help because Arthur would have wanted her to. Together, they built the house at Beecher's Hope, modest, just a ranch house and barn, but honest and theirs. For John, it represented everything he'd never thought possible: a home, a legitimate life, a chance to be a real father to Jack. Jack was growing into a young man, smart and well-read, thanks to Abigail's insistence on education. He didn't remember much about the gang, had been too young. John wanted to protect him from that knowledge, wanted him to grow up normal. One evening on their finished house's porch, watching sunset, John thought about Arthur, the man who'd saved him more times than he could count, who'd given everything so John could have this life. The cost of John's redemption had been paid in blood of better people than himself. and he'd carry that weight forever, but the past wasn't done yet. One piece of unfinished business remained. Micah Bell was still alive, unpunished for his betrayal. Sadie had been tracking him obsessively. She came to John with a proposition: help hunt down Micah. John was reluctant, wanting to leave the past behind, but Sadie appealed to his sense of justice, reminded him of everything Micah had done. He owed it to Arthur to make sure Micah didn't get away with his betrayals. John agreed, though Abigail opposed it. Afraid he'd be killed, John, Sadie, and Charles rode out together one more time, heading into mountains to find the rat who'd destroyed the Van der Linde gang. They tracked Micah to his camp high in the mountains. It was winter, snow covering everything, cold, brutal. They'd come too far to turn back. The confrontation was quick and violent. Sadie wanted to go in shooting, but they found an unexpected presence. Dutch Van der Linde was there. Dutch had been tracking Micah too, for his own reasons. Maybe he'd finally seen truth about Micah, or maybe he just wanted revenge. Whatever his motivation, Dutch was there when John, Sadie, and Charles arrived. The moment was tense as former gang members faced each other across years of betrayal and violence. Micah tried to talk, to manipulate Dutch one more time, but something had changed in Dutch. A shootout erupted. Micah's gang fought back, bullets flying in snow. John, Sadie, and Charles fought through Micah's men, determined to reach Micah himself. Finally, they cornered Micah Bell. He faced them defiant to the end, cursing them. Then Dutch, standing in shadows, made his choice. He shot Micah Bell dead, ending the life of the man who'd poisoned everything. Dutch stood over Micah's body, then looked at John with eyes holding nothing but emptiness. "I didn't go back for the money, John," Dutch said quietly, referring to the Blackwater money supposedly stashed years ago, "just so you know." Then Dutch walked away into snow and disappeared. They collected the Blackwater money, substantial, more than enough to secure John's ranch, ensure Jack's future. They'd gotten what Dutch had always promised, but only after everything else had been destroyed to get it. They left Micah's body in snow and rode down from the mountain. Sadie's revenge was complete, though it brought no peace. Charles was satisfied justice was done. John felt conflicted, sad it had come to this. Sad Dutch ended up so broken and alone. Back at Beecher's Hope, John deposited the money and returned to his ranch. Sadie left soon after for South America, still unable to settle, still driven by demons. Charles stayed a few months helping around the ranch, then departed to start his own life. John Marston was left with his family, finally and truly free from the past. The money secured their future. The ranch prospered. Jack grew into a young man who loved reading and learning, showed no interest in guns or violence. Abigail was content, having finally gotten the life she'd fought for. On quiet evenings, John would sometimes take out an old photograph of the gang from better days. He'd look at faces: Arthur, Hosea, Lenny, Sean, all dead. Dutch disappeared into wilderness. Others scattered to winds. An entire family broken and destroyed. John would think especially about Arthur, about that man who'd been more brother than John probably deserved, about Arthur's final sacrifice, those last words telling John to run, to live, to be better. John tried to honor that sacrifice, tried to be the man Arthur believed he could become. Abigail worried the law would come, that John's past would catch up, but years passed and nothing happened. The Pinkertons had bigger concerns. The world was changing fast, entering a new century, and old outlaws were being forgotten, turned into legends rather than real threats. The Van der Linde gang was gone, scattered to history. Most members were dead. Some survived: Charles, Sadie, John, Abigail, Jack, Uncle, and a few others. But they weren't a gang anymore, just individuals trying to make their way in a world that had moved on. Dutch Van der Linde lived on for a few more years, a ghost haunting mountains, occasionally pulling jobs but never building anything lasting. The philosopher outlaw, the revolutionary, the man who'd spoken so eloquently about freedom, ended up alone and broken. All his promises turned to ash. The West itself was dying in those years, or had already died. The frontier was closed. wilderness tamed and fenced, outlaws who'd roamed free were hunted down or reformed. The modern world, with its laws and telegraphs and automobiles, was replacing old ways. What was the legacy of the Van der Linde gang? They'd robbed and killed, leaving victims across multiple states. They'd fought against encroaching civilization, though whether that fight was noble or futile remained open to question. They'd been a family, genuinely caring for each other, until paranoia and bad decisions tore them apart. Maybe the real legacy was in people who survived to live better lives. Jack Marston, who'd grow up educated and thoughtful rather than violent. Charles Smith, who'd find his place in the world. Sadie Adler, who'd become strong instead of remaining a victim. John Marston, who'd break the cycle and give his family a chance at normalcy. And Arthur Morgan, dead at 36, who'd spent most of his life as an outlaw but found redemption in final months. Arthur's legacy was measured not in crimes committed, but in people saved, family helped to escape, the man he became when faced with mortality. The sun set on the American frontier around 1900, the Old West giving way to the new century. The outlaws and gunslingers, the native tribes and buffalo herds, the open ranges and unlimited possibilities, all passing into history and legend. The Van der Linde gang was just one small part of that larger story, one group trying to live free in a world that no longer allowed such freedom. For those who'd lived it, who'd been part of that family, the story would never truly end. They'd carry it with them for their remaining lives, memories of those lost, lessons learned, cost paid for choices made. John would think of Arthur on quiet evenings. Charles would remember Hosea's wisdom. Sadie would carry Jake's memory alongside her fury. That's the story of the Van der Linde gang from beginning to end. A story of loyalty and betrayal, dreams and disillusionment, family and its destruction. A story of the dying West and people who died with it, refusing to adapt, holding on to their way of life until it killed them or broke them or scattered them. It's a sad story in many ways, but there's beauty too. Beauty in Arthur's redemption, John's escape, the loyalty that bound them even when it shouldn't have. Beauty in the dream itself, even if impossible, even if it led to ruin. The world moves on, always and inevitably. The past fades, legends replace reality, and even the most dramatic lives become just stories. But for a moment, for a brief window at the end of the 1800s, the Van der Linde gang lived and fought and tried to be something more than common criminals. They failed, mostly, but they tried. And in the trying, in the loyalty and sacrifice and moments of genuine honor among violence and crime, they were human in all the complicated, contradictory ways people are human. Neither heroes nor villains. Just people doing their best with lives they'd been given, in a world changing faster than they could keep up with. Rest now and remember them. Remember the good alongside the bad, loyalty alongside betrayal, dreams alongside disasters. Remember they were real once, living and breathing and trying to survive in a world that had no place for them. The West is dead, and so are most of them, but the story lives on, keeping their memory alive in the only way that matters. And so the story ends, where stories always end, with sleep and dreams and the quiet knowledge that everything eventually comes to an end.